Welcome back to the first technical of the year. Now, if you're a farmer, a vet student, whoever, and you want to see more of these videos in 2023, if you haven't already, don't be afraid to click subscribe, ring the little bell next to it. That means you won't miss any new videos. It will also, incidentally, help me get closer to that 2023 target I've set of hitting 10,000 subscribers by the end of the year. But that is by the by. Now, January is a pretty grim, pretty grey month, at least in the UK. So I thought for this technical, we could all do with a good news story to start the year. The authority in charge of veterinary medicines in the UK is called the VMD. That is short for the Veterinary Medicines Directorate. Now, if you're averse to acronyms, I'm afraid it's only going to get worse from here. There are a lot of them coming up in this video. Now, the VMD publish an annual report called VARSS. Now, that's short for the UK Veterinary Antibiotic Resistance and Sales Surveillance, and it does what it says in the title. It reports on A, sales of antibiotics to animals in the UK, and B, patterns of resistance to those antibiotics in common infections. In this report, which, let's face it, in the grand scheme of things, not many people will ever end up reading, there is actually some very good news. Antibiotic sales for livestock have fallen by 55% since 2014, which is when they started recording them in this way. That is to their lowest ever levels last year. Now, if you're wondering, the dataset is only complete up to the end of 2021. That's because the data like this takes a long time to collate and process. So, although this was only published in November 2022, it goes up to the last complete data set, which is 2021. In about 11 months, we'll get the report for 2022. The link to that report and its highlights are in the video description, but let's delve into those results a bit more. Now, just to introduce you to this concept, a lot of these results are broken down as milligrams per PCU. A milligram is something you guys will be familiar with. That is just 1,000th of a gram. And then there's PCU, which stands for population corrected unit. And that represents a standard unit of biomass. Part of the problem we have when collating all this data is that livestock are totally different sizes, especially compared to humans. So livestock could be anything from a chicken to a cow to a trout to a sheep. Clearly, we need some way of standardizing it, and the PCU, it corrects for differences in size because we are weighing up the amount of antibiotic used in the context of how much livestock, how much biomass of animal it's being used across. So take this very simple example. If we have country A, country B, they both use the same amount of antibiotic, but country B has half the animals that country A does. You could argue that country A is doing twice as well because its antibiotic use is diluted across twice the volume of animals. Saying that, the absolute volume of antibiotics is still important, and so it is also considered here. That has also dropped to its lowest level since 2014, down about 52% since then and 6% on the year before this report, so 2020. Going back to milligrams per PCU, this adjusted figure, like I said, that is down 55% since 2014. The exact number is 28.3 milligrams per PCU for 2021. Here's a graph to show that relatively steady progress. You can see the big gains were made early on, but there still is a general trend downwards. Now, it's important that we break down these figures by different species. So here those figures are. And you can see the historically big users, pigs and poultry, have done tremendously well since 2014. Those are those figures to the far right of the graph. Year on year, most of them are still doing well, although yes, there are exceptions. Look at turkeys, for example. But then we have to put that into context of that 81% drop since 2014. And if there is a laggard here, it's salmon. Any of you fish vets watching, please feel free to leave some feedback in the comments. I'm just an ignorant cow and sheep vet. Not only have those MIGs per PCU increased year on year, but they're also significantly higher compared to when they started recording data. For that species, it was 2017. Now, this is what Salmon Scotland had to say on the matter. Read into that as you will. As I say, it'd be great to hear from some fish vets in the comments about where they think the next steps are. Now, all of those figures involve milligrams of antibiotics sold. There's no distinguishing between the types of antibiotics. It's just the total volume of all antibiotics antibiotics of all types sold for that species, corrected, like we said before, for the relative populations and size of each animal. That's our PCU. But actually, some of the antibiotics we use in veterinary medicine are more relevant to human medicine than others. The more relevant they are, the more serious is the consequences to human health would be if we generated resistance. Therefore, we're more interested in these families of antibiotics. And the most relevant families of antibiotics are called critically important antibiotics. That's CIAs. And then when we get into the really top tier, they are called highest priority critically important antibiotic HPCIAs. I told you there were a lot of acronyms in this video. And what's included under that umbrella of HPCIA? Really, it's the fluoroquinolones. So some of you will be familiar with brand names like Marbox or Marbacil. There's the third and fourth generation cephalosporin. So that is things like Naxel, Exceed, Cobactam. And finally, it's a family of one, colistin, which you'll be able to see in a second. We use virtually none of anyway. These are the antibiotics of last resort, so we want to avoid using them in veterinary species whenever we can. When we drill down specifically into this class of antibiotic, the headline is even better. Sales of HPCIAs have dropped for the 7th year in a row, so they have fallen faster than antibiotics in general. They've fallen 83% since 2014 and now form just 0.4% of all antibiotics sold in the UK. If we go species specific again, just like we did for antibiotics in general, you can see here again, pigs and poultry really are the gold medalists. Yes, there has been a very slight increase for meat poultry year on year, but you have to again put this in context of an overall 96% drop since 2014. That is immense. You have noticed that I've not actually mentioned cattle or sheep yet, and I know a lot of you will farm them. You have to go beyond the highlights and into the full report for these. And there's a couple of different reasons. Sheep and cattle farms don't often lend themselves to the neat sort of analysis that other farms do. For one, until very recently, there hasn't been any centralized hub for collecting this data. Medicine Hub in the UK is now trying to fill that gap. Another reason is that these farms are much less standardized in the number and the classes of stock. They're often a lot more complex. So take a beef farm, for example. A beef farm could be anything from a calf rearer to a suckled calf producer to a breeder finisher to a store producer to a purely finishing unit, and in any combination. So it starts to get very, very tricky to generate MIGs per PCU because PCU ends up going out of the window because that PCU can be far harder to calculate. But that work is forthcoming. Because it's more complicated, it's just taking more time to get there. Nonetheless, we do still have some data. So when we look at cattle since 2014, we can look at injectable HPCIAs. They've fallen by 78% since then. And intramammary HPCIAs, those are the antibiotics we inject directly into the udder. Sales of those have decreased by 96% since 2014. Both fantastic figures. Now, when we get onto sheep, we're generally pretty confident that sheep are low users of antibiotics. But because this is such an important issue for public health, we have to be confident that we can present this data to people from outside farming. They can't necessarily just take our word for this. It's too important. So again, sheep farmers are being invited to join Medicine Hub. We do still have some data, just like for the cattle. So for example, one of the exceptions to that general rule that sheep flocks are low users is the use of oral antibiotics in lambs. Now, sales of those antibiotics has fallen by nearly 50% between 2016 and 2021. As I mentioned before, as part of this surveillance, it's not just sales data this report looks at, it's looking at resistance profiles and patterns to common infections found in UK livestock. They're looking for certain bacteria like E. coli and Salmonella, and then seeing for those bugs, how likely are they to be resistant to certain antibiotics. If you're interested, this is definitely worth looking at. Again, the link is in the video description. Go and have a look for yourself. The general picture is that resistance is somewhere between very low and low, according to this definition from the European Food Standards Agency, and fairly static. But again, go and have a look at yourself if you've got time. So why is this worth celebrating? I think there's a few different reasons. Number one, antibiotic sales data is a reasonable proxy for how much antibiotics we're using. That's why we look at the sales data. But that in turn could be a reasonable proxy for the overall health of the animal population in the UK. If we're using less antibiotics, that suggests we're treating fewer sick animals. And now there could be a few different reasons for that, but hopefully at least part of the reason is that we are getting better at those preventative aspects. So that's everything from better use of technology, better husbandry, better nutrition, better hygiene, better use of vaccines, better use of genetics, all of these things. So I think it's fair to say that this represents a lot of hard work by farmers, and I hope also to some extent their vets, in advising them along the way. And the other thing about that is better health doesn't just mean less antibiotics sold. There are other sort of tag-along benefits. So that's better production, better animal welfare, better farmer well-being, especially if you're having to spend less time running around treating sick animals. And then as we expand further out of individual enterprises, we're looking at less antibiotics used in animals. Remember, the more antibiotics we use in animals, the more likely we are to generate resistant strains of bacteria in those animals. And that means the antibiotics are then less likely to work in those animals. Forget humans for a second. If we want these antibiotics to work for our livestock, we can't go on using them willy-nilly. We can only use them when absolutely necessary. Imagine if overnight antibiotics just stopped working in livestock. That would be not only a massive food security issue, not only a massive economic issue for farmers, but it would also be a terrible animal welfare issue. It is our absolute duty to safeguard these drugs. And then, even more importantly, if there is resistance in these animal infections, depending on the infection, that then can jump from the animal to human. It can also do it the other way around, in case you're wondering. And that could be from direct contact, and guess who's most at risk for that? It's farmers and their families. Could also be through indirect contact, could be through meat, milk, dung, and so on. You'll commonly see this referred to as antimicrobial resistance, or AMR, it's another acronym. And this is widely considered to be one of the greatest threats to human health and human civilization more broadly on the horizon. And finally, I think it's a massive triumph for farmers and farming organisations to have learned to collate this data so quickly and so effectively. For what's arguably a very fragmented industry, there's been fantastic mobilisation. Now, no doubt there's been a bit of carrot and a bit of stick involved, but in my opinion, the results really have been fantastic. This data is all collected on a voluntary basis. We may have a moral obligation to collect this data, but there's certainly no legal one. And so those are all reasons why I think this is a capital G good thing. It shows that farmers aren't just sticking with the status quo, they are making changes, and they're making them really bloody fast. And perhaps if there are other parts of the world which are lagging behind, they can look to us, they can learn from what worked for us, and they can also learn what didn't work for us and avoid that. And so why am I telling you all of this? Is it so if you're a vet or a farmer or a vet student, you can give yourself a nice pat on the back and say to yourself, aren't we bloody fantastic? Look, I think credit where credit's due. There's been a lot of good work going into this, and you can see some fantastic results. But that's not really why I'm telling you this. It's because we operate in a very information-dense world that can often be hard to navigate. Personally, I think it's possible and important to accept these two things, and they're not contradictory. That one, even where we are isn't good enough. We need to get better. And two, to look at how far we've come and celebrate that and say, look, we have got momentum. We need to keep this going. Indeed, like we mentioned before, going cold turkey from these drugs, it would have been very, very, very effective at cutting our antibiotic use in animals, but at what cost? What cost to farmers, what cost to food security, at what cost to animal welfare? Honestly, I think the most sensible approach is to taper that use. So when you have an exchange at the pub, on Twitter, wherever, maybe it's better to avoid those exchanges altogether, but if you decide to offer up some balance to the argument, you can have these figures in your back pocket. That, in less than a decade, farmers have reduced the amount of antibiotics they've used by 55%. That for the most important antibiotics, they've reduced it by 83%. And they've done this in a space of less than 10 years in a business that is notoriously reluctant to change. And as an industry, they've done it off their own back. Honestly, I think these figures are great talking points for members of the public, people who buy food, who value animal welfare, who value their environment and value their own health. Because, let's face it, they've heard the other side of the story. These facts aren't there to beat anyone down with. Like I said, they are there to provide balance. So in that vein, yes, these figures are fantastic, but where could we do better? Now, this is just me taking my cues from my reading of the report, but this is what I thought reading it. So one, continue to publish that data. We can't expect the general public to just take our word for these things and continue to publish it sector by sector. So we can see, just as there was in this report, there are differences. Some sectors are doing better than others. Again, it's not a stick to beat anyone with. It's a case of looking at, right, so the pigs and poultry tried this, that worked very well. How could we apply that to game birds, to salmon, to any other sector where perhaps the progress isn't as positive? Another takeaway was that yes, cattle and sheep, we're pretty sure from the snippets of data we have that we're doing pretty well. But to reach equivalence with the other sectors, we still need to get better, especially at the reporting side. And don't get me wrong, there are people pouring vast amounts of effort and money at this. If you're a UK dairy, sheep, beef farmer, and you haven't already looked at the Medicines Hub, I highly recommend doing that. Again, I will stick the link in the video description. And the final takeaway is yes, we have to absolutely continue to monitor resistance, because that has been a lot more static than antibiotic sales. So that's it for this one. Like I said, if you want to delve deeper into the report, into its highlights, into the Medicines Hub, the links for those are in the video description. I'll see you next time.